Welcome to Module 2B, where we will be working on understanding research papers. So to begin, we'll be starting by decomposing the components of a research paper. At essentially every paper's core, there are specific components that they all hit. And these are and are usually organized in the following order: the abstract and the intro, methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion. However, just because the paper is organized in that way does not mean you have to go in that order while reading it. In fact, you probably don't want to when attempting to identify if a paper is relevant to read for your topic. We'll discuss that after we break down each component in the next few slides. So to start, let's go over the abstract. It's probably one of the most important points when you're reading a paper. It provides a short summary, and it's essentially a crossroad for you to decide whether to read a paper because it contains that summary of the paper, which includes the essential results and the overall methods that they used in the research, which will help you decide if it's relevant to work with or not, whether it's helpful for your project or not, whether you will be able to use it to gain knowledge from, work as a basis for background work, or just learn from. And it definitely helps the most to read an abstract or go through the whole literature review process when you already have something that you're interested in, a field or area, a topic of study.
So moving on to the introduction is an especially important part and interesting part of the paper. It's probably one of the most difficult parts when making your own paper, which we'll discuss in later videos. So in the introduction, you can usually find the background information or the general reading of the field, the hypothesis being tested, and the setups and conditions or the constraints for the experiment, and obviously the applications of the paper. Moving on to the methodology is a step-by-step process that the researchers take in undertaking their experiments. So reading the methodologies not only helps with conducting your own project, but also for inspiration when conducting your research on improving aspects of a process. For example, drug transportation techniques. If you find a flaw that you notice in a paper, you can try investigating that. So the methodology will also be very concise in describing the process to obtaining the results, but also be very diligent in noting all details, as anything in the experiment may have impacted the results. So you may need to connect the dots and kind of figure out what they aren't saying or leaving unsaid, because the researchers may consider it too clear or obvious, even though it really isn't. Moving on to the results. So when it comes to reading a research paper, jumping straight to the results allows you to quickly see the outcomes of the study without kind of getting bogged down in the methodology and the terminology. So looking for key data outcomes that directly address the research question or hypothesis, checking for graphs, tables, or figures that kind of summarize the data, understand the trends, patterns, or any notable points. The results also pay attention to p-values, confidence intervals, or any other indicators of significance that kind of support the results. And the results obviously also note any part of the results that were either surprising or diverge from the expected hypothesis. So at the end of these results, you can kind of see whether these findings were consistent or inconsistent across different papers that you can also look into to kind of find inspiration for your own project. So lastly, moving on to the discussion. The discussion section of the research paper is where the authors interpret and kind of explain the significance of their findings in the context of the study's objectives and existing literature. So it typically includes an interpretation of results. Authors explain what the results mean, kind of why they're important, and how they answer the research questions or support/refute the hypothesis. There's also comparison with the existing research. The results are compared to previous studies to highlight similarities, differences, or any new insights. So there's also implications. The broader impact of the findings is discussed, including how they contribute to the field or how they have practical implications. And obviously the limitations or any weaknesses or constraints in the studies are acknowledged. And these can include factors of any reliability. And finally is the future research, which contains suggestions for any additional studies or any unanswered questions that emerged from the current research.
Alright, so now we're going to be talking about reading papers efficiently. So, the optimal order that we decided to read a paper is the abstract, the parts of the introduction, results/discussion, and then methodology. And you may be thinking, Why? Why not just read the paper as it is? Well, usually when you're reading a paper, you're first getting into the research topic and you just want a general sense of the idea and the main points of the paper. So it's more important to understand the paper's purpose and applications and findings from the paper rather than getting overwhelmed by the complex methods. For example, let's say you're reading a paper about machine learning and you want to see it's the background of the model and then what the model achieved, right? So then you read the abstract to get a summary of the paper, you read the introduction to get the background on why they did what they did, and then you skip to the results to see what happened. And then later on, when you can go back and look at the methods, but you most likely won't understand some of them because it may be too complex and go over your head. And like we said, it's important to focus on the overall application of the paper rather than focusing on the specific methodology. But later, when you're working on your own research project, you can look back and be like, I remember that one paper that did this, and go back. And then maybe once you start, you'll understand the methodology better. But that's just optimal order that we decided to read a paper. And finally, checking the relevance. So always check for the most recent results on a question, publishing year maybe like max 10 years ago, and it's also important to take into account the field rate of evolution, right? For example, AI and ML papers are going to have a much faster rate of evolution as compared to bio or math, right? Because for math, the results last a long time. So when reading articles and citing articles, make sure they're relevant. For example, let's say you're doing a cancer project and you're using some statistics on how relevant the cancer is globally and how much deaths it causes annually, and you use a statistic from 2007. Of course, that was relevant, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but there are going to be newer papers out there that have newer, more accurate, up-to-date statistics. So it's always important to keep that in mind when reading articles and citing articles.